From being one of the best kickers in the sport to never ever getting tired during a fight, here's why fighters are terrified of Yair Rodríguez. As one of the most exciting fighters on the UFC roster, Yair's an absolute master when it comes to putting on a show. He's got flair, variety, and most importantly, creativity when he's in the cage. Now, he's obviously not the only guy in the UFC with these traits. In fact, for the majority of his career, El Pantera has been labeled as your classic action fighter. That's no longer the case for him though, because now there's another word for him: champion. And he couldn't have done it without his insane kicks. Seriously, it's a skill that largely goes under the radar in the UFC because it seems super simple and there's not much variation in it. I mean, these days most fighters are using kicks to wear their opponent's legs down or bring them to the ground. And the high kicks are just a bit too risky because then you get swept off the ground. But Yair, there's no one who does it like him in the UFC. His opponents never know when a kick is coming or where it's coming from. He can switch angles and stances on the go, and there's just such versatility in the way he stands and moves around that he could probably come up with a counter for any fighter in the world. In fact, Yair actually chooses the exact opposite stance as his opponent just so he could hit them with a gut-destroying body kick. Besides, even if it's true that he doesn't knock people out with his kicks, it's still a source of consistent damage for him, and when his opponents are feeling the pain from all those kicks, he switches over to his incredible range of punches. Yeah, he's good with his feet and with his fists. Though, while he uses his kicks to whittle opponents down, Yair's punches can be much more effective at actually finishing fights. But his jab, though, that's almost impossible to predict. It's so quick and sneaky that no one ever sees it coming. But you know what's even more impressive about Yair's jabs? They actually hit hard. Yet most fighters use these as a way to disorient their opponents. Yair, on the other hand, can hurt people with his jabs, which is great because he can jab without actually moving his feet too much, and that in turn means that he's firmly planted and isn't vulnerable for a sweep or something. That's not all though, because Yair's left hook is also pretty decent. As a matter of fact, most of his punches can be devastating if they land correctly. Still, he uses most of his other moves just to sprinkle some variety into his game, and they don't actually matter in the grand scheme of things. They're there to throw his opponents off. After all, when an opponent tries to block a kick or a left hook, it leaves a big opening for that deadly jab. You know why he's so good at kicks and punches though? Well, it's all because of his upbringing. Growing up in Mexico, Yair was always meant to be a quick and explosive fighter. Not to mention, boxing is deeply respected in the country and is a big part of their culture alongside wrestling. So naturally, Yair got into boxing and taekwondo at the age of 5. In fact, he's even got a black belt in taekwondo. Yeah, no wonder he's so good at kicking people. Still, he never really got into the wrestling side of things, which means that Yair doesn't do much when it comes to grappling. As a matter of fact, there's not much to his ground game either. Well, except for his devastating punches, of course. Then again, that's not necessarily a bad thing because you see, where a lot of other fighters try to diversify their movesets and spread themselves thin, Yair knows exactly what he's good at. And he sure as hell sticks with it for maximum efficiency. Besides, it's all pretty evident in his record, and he's been a part of the UFC for almost a decade, and has only ever lost 2 fights in the promotion. Don't let all the talk of his weak grappling fool you though, because Yair is still really good at submission holds. In fact, while this was genuinely one of his weaker points, he's worked hard on it over the years to diversify the way he could finish fights. I mean, he's added so much new stuff to his game now that he's almost unrecognizable from the fighter he was a decade ago. In many ways, his evolution isn't too dissimilar to Anthony Pettis, because he too went from being the guy who threw the Showtime kick to a guy who armbarred the mighty Benson Henderson. Likewise, Yair's also added some submission holds to his game. When he came up against Josh Emmett, everyone thought he'd be sticking to his normal game and wearing Josh down. And yeah, he did pull out his usual tricks against the guy, but no one could have predicted what Yair was about to do during round 2. About 4 minutes in, El Pantera went ahead and attempted a triangle choke off his back, which was an insane move when you consider just how tough and durable Emmett is. And yet Yair pulled it off in spectacular fashion, making Josh tap out and winning the UFC interim featherweight title. Honestly, this was the moment when people really started thinking about Yair seriously. I mean, he'd obviously been on everyone's radar for being an amazing fighter. But this fight, it made him elite and has raised his profile within the MMA world. Yair's no longer the up-and-coming star who's got potential to fulfill. He's already done that and is now one of the biggest superstars in the UFC. He has this incredible ability to get the crowds going. After all, everyone loves a good showman. And even if fighters don't like to admit it, that sort of support from the arena can really spell fear in the hearts of your opponents. I mean, anyone coming up against Yair will know instantly that they're the bad guy, because the crowd will only be cheering for El Pantera. And that, folks, can put a lot of pressure on even the strongest of minds. Besides, even his UFC 290 opponent, Alexander Volkanovski, couldn't stop saying good things about him. Obviously, he talked about how Yair can be great with his flashy moves in the octagon, but what really impressed Volk was the fact that he's now more comfortable at all ranges. Whether you're pressuring him from long range or going up close and personal, Yair's got a counter in his arsenal. Not to mention, he can fire all sorts of attacks from different angles, making him super unpredictable. So according to Volk, Rodríguez is definitely one of the most dangerous fighters out there, and with the way he's constantly adding tools to his game, the sky's the limit for him. That being said, it's not just Volk who's impressed by him. Everyone in the MMA world is on Team Yair now. Max Holloway, for instance, believes that the octagon is an escape for someone like Yair, which is why he's able to spread his wings and work his magic. He says that for a lot of UFC fighters, the outside world is the exhausting part of the job. Not to mention, Yair had a rough upbringing, and his family struggled a lot financially. In fact, he was never a big moneymaker even when he got into the UFC. So Max thinks that now everything Yair does in the ring is a reflection of all the difficulties he's overcome. Chael Sonnen also says that what Yair's doing in the octagon is truly unbelievable stuff. In fact, he claims that El Pantera would go down as the most dynamic guy that he's ever seen. Yes, even more than Demetrius Johnson. For Sonnen, it's Yair's creativity that sets him apart from everyone else. And in many ways, the moves he comes up with are almost video game-like. Likewise, Michael Chiesa's also called him a special talent in the past. With that said, there's no use having so many moves in your locker if you don't even get the chance to execute them, right? Well, that's what makes Yair different too. Because he's got infinite stamina. No, seriously, this dude probably has the best pair of lungs in the entire UFC. I mean, even if the fight goes on for 5 rounds, he's never tired. Instead, he keeps his energy levels at max throughout his matches, delivering the same kicks, punches, and everything in between. In fact, in many of his fights, it's almost as if he gets a second win the longer the fight goes on, as he becomes even more active than before. And that, folks, is the best weapon you can have when your opponents are tired and slow after a few rounds of intense fighting. So, from never even getting tired during a fight to being one of the best kickers in the sport, that's why fighters are terrified of Yair Rodríguez.